I never expected anything unusual the day my landlady introduced me to her friend, but when her hand rested on mine and didn't move, my entire world shifted in that single, silent moment. I had only been living in the city for a few weeks when I found myself stepping into a quiet little apartment, the kind of place that seemed to hold its breath between the noise of the streets outside. The landlady greeted me warmly, as she always did, with a kind smile and a fuss over whether I'd eaten. She was the sort of person who made the walls feel less empty. But that evening, she wasn't alone. Her friend was with her. I noticed her almost immediately, not because she demanded attention, but because she carried herself in a way that quietly filled the room. She was in her early 40s, perhaps, with a presence that was both graceful and calm. There was no attempt to appear younger than she was. If anything, it was her confidence, the way she held herself, that made her striking. She glanced at me as I entered, and for a moment, I forgot what I was supposed to say. Her eyes were steady, warm but searching, as if she could see more of me than I meant to show. She smiled politely, the kind of smile that lingers just enough to leave you wondering if it meant more. The landlady introduced us, her voice cheerful. I shook her friend's hand. It was soft, cool against mine, and though it lasted only a second, something about that brief touch stayed with me, like a faint aftertaste of something rare. We all sat together in the living room. The evening sun was slipping through the curtains, casting long strips of golden light across the carpet. The kettle hissed from the kitchen, and the faint clinking of cups soon joined our conversation. I remember the details so vividly because I found myself paying attention in a way I hadn't in a long time. Every sound, every movement seemed sharper with her there. She didn't talk much at first, just listened with a quiet attentiveness that made even the landlady's everyday stories feel important. But when she did speak, her voice carried a low, steady tone that seemed to calm the air around her. I caught myself watching the way her fingers wrapped gently around the teacup, the way she leaned slightly forward when she listened. It wasn't attraction in the obvious sense. It was subtler than that. A sense of being drawn towards someone before you've even realized you've taken a step. When she stood to leave the room for a moment, the faintest trace of her perfume lingered where she had been sitting. Not overpowering, just a light, floral note that seemed to settle into the air. I caught myself breathing in a little deeper, though I quickly straightened when I realized what I was doing. I told myself she was simply my landlady's friend. Nothing more. But deep down, some quiet part of me already knew she would not remain just a passing acquaintance. After that first meeting, I began to notice how often she visited the apartment. Sometimes it was planned. The landlady would mention that her friend was coming over for tea. Other times, it seemed almost casual, as if she had just decided to stop by. I never asked for reasons, but each time she appeared, I felt something in me quietly shift. At first, it was nothing more than polite conversation. She would ask how I was settling into the neighborhood, whether the city felt overwhelming, and I would answer in the same easy, surface-level way. But the more we spoke, the more I realized she wasn't simply being polite. She listened. Really listened. She would tilt her head slightly when I talked, her eyes steady on mine, as if every word mattered. I started to linger, finding excuses not to leave the room when she was around. If the landlady excused herself to the kitchen, I'd stay behind with her friend, pretending to flip through a newspaper or check my phone, though my attention was drawn only to her. One afternoon, she asked me what kind of books I liked to read. It seemed like such a simple question, but the way she asked it, softly, with genuine curiosity, made me pause. I told her about the authors I admired, the way certain stories had stayed with me. She smiled, not in that dismissive way people sometimes smile when they don't really care, but in a way that suggested she wanted to remember what I said. Then she told me about her own favorites, her voice low and thoughtful, and I realized how much life she carried in her words, stories of years I had not lived, of feelings she had already known. It was in these small exchanges that something unspoken began to grow between us. One evening, the three of us sat together at the table. The landlady poured tea, her chatter filling the air. Her friend, seated beside me, reached for the sugar bowl and passed it across. As she placed it in front of me, her fingers brushed mine. It was barely a second, a fleeting touch that anyone else might have ignored, but the warmth of it lingered long after. I looked up instinctively, and she was already looking at me. Her gaze wasn't bold or forward. It was quiet, questioning, almost as if she was waiting to see if I had felt the same spark. I swallowed, suddenly aware of how close our hands had been, how her perfume had drifted toward me again, faint and delicate. The landlady returned to her story, oblivious. We both looked away, but I knew the moment hadn't been an accident. From then on, every conversation, every smile, every glance carried something extra, a current running beneath the surface. Something neither of us had named, but both of us had already begun to feel. It happened one evening, almost by accident. I had come downstairs to return something to my landlady, a book she'd lent me, and found her and her friend already in the living room. They invited me to sit, and I stayed, not wanting to seem rude, though the truth was I welcomed any reason to be near her. The room was dimly lit, a single lamp glowing in the corner. The landlady was cheerful as always, recounting some story about her neighbors. I tried to listen, but I was aware of her friend sitting just a little too close to where I had settled on the sofa. Our shoulders weren't quite touching, but the space between us felt fragile, as if the smallest shift could close it. Then the landlady's phone rang. She excused herself, stepping into another room. Suddenly, it was just the two of us. The silence was immediate, but not uncomfortable. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant hum of the street outside, and, beneath it all, the soft rhythm of her breathing. She turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "You're quiet," she said softly. I smiled a little, suddenly self-conscious. I didn't want to interrupt. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "You're not interrupting. I'd rather hear about you anyway. You're new here. Tell me, what do you miss most about home?" Her question caught me off guard. Not many people ask things like that, not with real interest. I hesitated, then told her about the small things, my mother's cooking, the streets I used to walk, the friends I had left behind. My voice wavered at times, but she never looked away. She listened, leaning slightly toward me, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her attention fixed as though my story mattered more than anything else in that moment. When I finished, she nodded slowly, her gaze softening. "That's the hardest part, isn't it? Leaving behind what feels familiar, trying to make something new." There was something in her voice, a quiet depth, that told me she wasn't only speaking about me. I wanted to ask what she meant, what she had left behind, but I stopped myself. Instead, I simply said, "You understand." Her eyes held mine for a moment longer. "Yes," she whispered. The landlady's laughter suddenly rang out from the other room, breaking the spell. But in those few minutes, something had shifted. I realized then how natural it felt to be alone with her, how easy it was to speak words I usually kept to myself. And though we had only shared stories in silence, I carried that moment with me long after I returned to my apartment. The sound of her voice, the warmth of her presence, and the memory of sitting side by side in that quiet room. It was on a rainy evening when the moment finally happened. I had been invited downstairs again, more out of habit than anything else. The landlady insisted I shouldn't spend my evenings cooped up alone, and her friend was there as usual, seated gracefully by the window. The soft patter of rain against the glass filled the silences between our conversations, steady and calming. We were sharing tea, the three of us. The landlady's cheerful stories filled the room, but my attention was only half on her words. Most of it was on her friend, the way she listened with quiet amusement, her lips curving into a smile that never reached laughter but carried warmth all the same. At one point, the landlady went to fetch more snacks from the kitchen, leaving the two of us at the table. We sat side by side, cups in hand, the rain outside pressing softly against the world. She said something. I can't even remember what it was now, but it made us both laugh. Real laughter, the kind that lightens the chest. In the midst of it, her hand slipped onto mine. At first, I thought it was accidental, a simple brush of fingers as she reached across. But then her palm settled fully over the back of my hand, her touch light but deliberate. And she didn't move. The moment stretched. My heart picked up, each beat louder in my ears. I glanced down at our hands, hers resting gently on mine, elegant and composed, as though it belonged there. Her skin was cool at first, but slowly I felt the warmth seep through, the faint pressure of her fingers anchoring me in that instant. I looked up at her, searching her expression. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes held mine steadily, with something unspoken flickering there. Hesitation, perhaps, Or maybe the courage of someone who had decided, just for a moment, not to hide what she felt. I didn't move either. I couldn't. That simple touch carried more weight than 1,000 words. It was a quiet confession, a risk wrapped in silence. The air between us changed. The sound of the rain seemed softer, the ticking of the clock sharper. Even the faint aroma of her perfume felt stronger, surrounding me, pulling me closer without either of us leaning in. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. And she didn't seem to expect them. She just let her hand remain there, as if testing whether I would pull away. I didn't. I couldn't have, even if I'd tried. By the time the landlady returned, her friend had lifted her hand back, gracefully, as though nothing had happened. She joined the conversation again, her voice calm, her composure intact. But I sat there, still feeling the imprint of her hand on mine. The warmth, the weight, the quiet electricity of a touch that had changed everything between us. After that evening, I found myself carrying the weight of her hand long after it had left mine. It sounds strange, but I could still feel it, the faint warmth pressed against my skin, the deliberate stillness of the moment. It haunted me, in the quiet of my apartment, when I lay awake staring at the ceiling. And yet, neither of us spoke of it. The very next time we saw each other, everything appeared normal. She greeted me with the same calm warmth, asked about my day, sipped her tea as though nothing had shifted between us. But I noticed the difference in the way her gaze lingered a little longer, or how her words sometimes trailed off, leaving a silence heavy with things unsaid. I felt it too. Every time I sat near her, I remembered the touch. My hands betrayed me, restless, my fingers tapping lightly against my cup or folding too tightly into one another. I wanted to reach across, to reclaim that connection, but hesitation held me back. Was it wrong to feel this way? She was older, wiser, someone whose life was far richer in experience. And I was just me. I worried that my feelings were too transparent, that perhaps I was imagining the meaning behind her touch. Maybe it had been nothing, a fleeting gesture I had clung to because I wanted it to matter. But then there were her glances. Sometimes, when the landlady spoke and I wasn't looking directly at her friend, I would feel it, her eyes resting on me. And when I finally turned, she would look away just a little too quickly or smile faintly as though covering something. It left me suspended between certainty and doubt. One evening, the three of us sat in the living room again, the landlady chatting while her friend sat quietly beside me. At one point, our hands almost touched on the sofa cushion between us. Not quite, just close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her skin. I thought for a moment that she might move closer, that her fingers might brush mine again. But she didn't. She stayed still, her hands folded neatly, her composure intact. And so the silence grew louder. We spoke about ordinary things, weather, books, the city. But beneath every word was the echo of that moment we hadn't acknowledged. It was as though we were walking carefully around it, afraid that naming it would make it too real or too fragile to survive. When she finally stood to leave that night, she offered a polite good night. Yet as she turned toward the door, her eyes met mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary. There was something in them, hesitation, longing, maybe even regret. And then she was gone. I sat there long after, torn between relief and frustration, my heart heavy with the truth I couldn't speak, that her silence was not emptiness, but a confession of its own. It happened on a quieter evening than most. The landlady had stepped out unexpectedly to visit a neighbor, leaving her friend and me alone in the apartment. The room felt different without her cheerful presence filling every pause. The silence stretched between us, softer but heavier, like a blanket neither of us knew how to lift. I sat across from her at the small wooden table, my cup of tea untouched. She was staring at hers too, tracing her fingertip along the rim as though the circle could hold her thoughts in place. For once, I didn't try to hide my restlessness. My hands were tense, my shoulders tight, and I think she noticed. She looked up, her eyes catching mine. "You're quieter than usual," she said, her voice gentle but carrying an undertone of something more. I let out a short breath, almost a laugh, though it wasn't amusement. "I don't always know what to say around you." That confession surprised even me. Her expression softened, but she didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her hand lowering from the teacup to rest loosely against the table. "I should be the one saying that," she admitted. Her voice was steady, but there was a faint tremor beneath it. I've found myself watching you more closely than I mean to. The words hung in the air. I felt my pulse quicken, not just from what she said, but from the quiet bravery it took to say it. I leaned forward, searching her face. Then it wasn't just me. Her eyes glimmered, as though some weight had just been shared. She gave a small shake of her head, her lips curving into a rueful smile. No, it wasn't just you. But it should have been easier to ignore. You're younger, people would talk, and she paused, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with a hand that trembled slightly. I should know better. Her vulnerability pulled me closer than any words of affection could have. I felt the urge to reach across the table, to take that trembling hand, but I held still for a moment longer. I wanted her to see that I wasn't rushing, that I understood the weight of what she was saying. You don't have to know better with me, I said quietly. I don't care what people would say. All I know is that when I'm with you, it feels right. It feels natural. She looked at me as though measuring the truth in my voice. Then, slowly, her hand slid across the table until her fingers touched mine. This time, there was no hesitation, no pretending it was an accident. Her hand trembled slightly, but she let it rest against mine, warm and real. The moment wasn't grand or dramatic, but in her touch, and in her eyes, was the simple, fragile truth we had both been afraid to name. And once spoken, even without words, it could no longer be hidden. The days after our confession carried a quiet change. Nothing outwardly dramatic shifted. We didn't suddenly cling to each other, nor did we speak in whispers of love. But there was an unspoken understanding now, a thread of closeness woven into even the simplest exchanges. One evening, the landlady had stepped out to run errands, leaving the two of us alone again. The apartment was dim, lit only by the soft amber glow of the lamp in the corner. Rain had passed earlier, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth drifting in through the half-open window. We sat together on the sofa, not speaking much at first. There was comfort in the silence, as if words weren't necessary anymore. Her hand was near mine on the cushion between us, and this time, neither of us hesitated. Our fingers found each other naturally, her touch steady and calm, as though this had been waiting to happen all along. She sighed softly, leaning back, her head tilting just enough to rest lightly against my shoulder. The weight of her presence was gentle but grounding. I could feel the warmth of her cheek brushing the fabric of my shirt, her hair soft against my jaw. I never thought I'd let myself feel this way again, she murmured, almost as if confessing to herself rather than to me. I turned slightly, careful not to break the closeness. I'm glad you did, I whispered back. Her fingers tightened around mine, just slightly, enough to tell me she heard me, enough to let me know she felt the same. Time seemed to slow. The ticking of the clock on the wall grew softer, the world outside more distant. In that small living room, with nothing more than the glow of a lamp and the quiet of evening, everything felt complete. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes met mine with a steadiness that held no fear now, only a quiet certainty. She leaned closer, closing the distance in a way so natural it felt inevitable. Her cheek brushed against mine, her lips hovering close but not quite touching. It wasn't a kiss, not yet. Just the delicate press of her skin against mine, the faint brush of her hair as she whispered, "Good night." The tenderness of that moment settled deep within me. It wasn't the kind of passion that roared loudly. It was quieter, steadier, more enduring. It felt like the beginning of something that didn't need to announce itself to the world to be real. When she finally pulled back, her hand still lingered in mine. She rose gracefully, pausing at the doorway, her eyes lingering on me with a softness that spoke more than words ever could. And as the door clicked shut behind her, I sat there in the dim light, my heart steady, knowing with absolute certainty that whatever shape this bond would take, it was ours. Something gentle, something real, something we no longer needed to pretend we didn't feel. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and join me for more slow burn romances like this one. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what part stayed with you the most.